This is an interview in the oral history collection for the University of Alabama Archives. I'm Charles Lundquist. This is March 16, 2006, and today we have as our guest Bill Hallisey. Bill, it's good to have you here. We appreciate your coming. To start the conversation, can you give us a little background on where you spent your youth, where you were educated, and how you got into the space program?
Well, I'm a displaced Yankee.
Displaced Yankee, all right.
Now, I was born in New Hampshire. Attended the University of New Hampshire and graduated there with a degree in mechanical engineering. After that, I hired in with Chrysler Corporation in Detroit. Did a short stint in the Army, came back to Chrysler, and they said, how'd you like to go to Huntsville, Alabama? I said, okay. Came down here in 1958 and loved it, stayed. After leaving Chrysler after, about 1960, I went with the Army to backfill, if you will, all of the slots that when Marshall Space Flight Center was formed, to backfill those slots and work on the Jupiter weapons system and transfer that system over to the Air Force. Once we accomplished that, in about a year's time, I transferred over to Marshall. Worked in the old propulsion and vehicle engineering division for about a year or two, then transferred up to the Saturn project office and was on the S1C stage, was the business manager on that stage for quite a few years. Then,
who was the director of that operation?
That project, the S1C project, was Matt Erlob at the time. Connie Dannenberg was the head of the project office, or program office, I guess it was called. And we had a ball in those early days.
As business manager, with whom did you interface?
Primarily, of course, with the contractor, which was Boeing. Boeing was located both here in Huntsville, but primarily in New Orleans, where they were taking the old Michoud facility and turning it over into a production facility for the first stage of the Saturn V. And interfaced also with, of course, the Washington folks and the business folks in the local area.
Any particular problems or amusing incidents that you recall from that period?
On the S1C, we had a lot of interesting problems.
I imagine you did.
On the engineering side, of course, there was a few problems that crept in, but Pogo being one of the biggest ones. But we had a great relationship between the contractor and Marshall Space Flight Center in the engineering group. So those problems were resolved rather rapidly. On the business side, we had a lot of fun converting the contracts that we had with Boeing and the other Saturn V contractors from the old cost plus fixed fee contracts to incentive contracts. And that was a very interesting time because it was all brand new. Nobody really knew much about incentive contracting. So we went through that process and a lot of fun. And of course, that was back when Arthur Rudolph was Saturn V program manager in Huntsville. That was an interesting time. A lot of fun.
Well, what are some of your remembrances of Arthur?
He was a character. I want to put it that way. He was a driver. He really drove his people to perfection. And I got to say that about the guy. He didn't care much about your social life or your family. He had a job to do, and that's what he set out to do. And you got to give him credit for that because he did a marvelous job. It was a tough job. He was trying to integrate 4 or 5 pieces of hardware into a vehicle, and a lot of interfaces, a lot of managers, a lot of contractors. So, but it was a fun time.
I seem to remember some tales about the long meetings he used to hold.
I recall one time we were trying to resolve the issue of configuration management. You know, what is it? How do you work it, and so forth. And he was going late into the evening, and I caught him during one of the breaks, and I said, Arthur, no, I didn't call him Arthur. I called him Dr. Rudolph. I said, I've got an appointment downtown with the mayor at 7 o'clock tonight, and I've got to leave early. Well, he's chastised me for making appointments outside of work, you know. Yeah, he'd go late into the evening, 10, 11 o'clock at night, and he always had a drawer in his desk, a drawer full of candy bars, which he proceeded to re-nourish himself.
Well, when the Saturn program started drawing to a close, where did you go next? What did you do next?
Well, towards the end of Saturn, the shuttle started to come along. So I moved over into the, what do they call it, preliminary development group, where they started looking at the phase A, or the initial phases of a shuttle program, trying to define what it was. And that lasted a few years, and spent a lot of time talking with what we call phase A contractors, or the preliminary design contractors, until a configuration was chosen.
Who were those contractors at that time?
Oh my goodness! Of course, the Boeings and the Lockheeds and Martins and Rocketdyne and the big ones that were around, that they had the phase A studies and looking at different concepts. Big interface, obviously, with Houston, because Houston was vying for the lead in the shuttle program at that time. So good competition between Huntsville, Marshall, and Johnson in those activities. So during those days, yeah, I did a lot of work on the business side, developing the statements of work, working the issues of procurement, how would you do procurement, and so forth. Ended up finally selecting a configuration, and then moving out and selecting the prime contractors for the various pieces of the shuttle program. So at that time, I was in the business office, program control office, if you will, of the shuttle program. Of course, at the time, you know, that was Bob Lindstrom, and I worked there for a few years, and then got an assignment that you would recognize, the atmospheric cloud physics program, which was a very exciting program, I thought, until it got canceled by our friends in Washington for various reasons.
That was the TRW was involved in that, as I recall.
TRW, and what I enjoyed about that program is the relationship with the scientists, because that was my first exposure from an engineering to working with the science crowd. Different, entirely different philosophy of working things, and so it was kind of an eye-opener, but I enjoyed it.
Did you get acquainted with Dolph Teal during that period?
Teal?
Dolph Teal.
Yes, but...
He was the, vice president or something of TRW over this activity at the time.
Yeah, vaguely remember. But that was a fun time, too. It's too bad we had to lose that program, but... then I came back onto the shuttle program and took over the program control office and worked that, gee whiz, until about 1988, 89 time frame.
So through several of the first flights of the shuttle then?
Oh yeah. Was fortunate to be down for the first launch of shuttle. That was quite an emotional activity, to see a bunch of grown men from the various contractors actually crying when that thing lifted off. It was a very exciting, very emotional time.
I gather there are plans for some kind of a reunion of the STS-1 activity?
There's something going on, I heard. Somebody hollered and asked for my name if I worked on the S2, S1. There's some kind of a activity in Washington, I guess, sometime in April. I've just heard that through the grapevine. I haven't seen any official.
Well, they said something about it at the last Retirees Associated meeting.
Also during that time, Chuck, I worked as the deputy manager of the external tank program, and that was a lot of fun. And I happened to be at the Cape during the Challenger accident, so that was
a sad event.
Very sad thing to go through that experience. I was sitting in one of the consoles, watching the launch, seeing it through the window as well, and then as it disappeared above the window, back to the console, and then saw what would happen. I didn't believe my eyes. I just said, "Well, it'll come out of that cloud in a minute." But so we had to go back and some trying times there.
See, I believe they embargoed all the data right at the time, did they not?
Shut everything down. They wouldn't let us out. They locked us up. And as everybody knows the history of the Challenger, but as far as that activity is concerned, yes, all the data was embargoed. Meetings were held, interviews were held. I think we were locked up for probably 8 to 10 hours and finally released. Obviously, the intent was to lock up the data and get everything down before everybody left, which was a good idea.
Who made that decision, or was it automatic?
I don't really know who actually made the decision. Yeah, I think it was fairly automatic. That's procedures are written when you have an event like that. I do recall the vice president coming down and actually meeting with the people in the building, which I thought was very nice. So.
Well, how did your career progress after you left the shuttle program?
Well, I had an opportunity to join on a brand new program on the West Coast with the Air Force. It was called the Advanced Launch System, ALS. So I went out there and spent a year as the deputy director of that program. And that was another interesting experience working with the Air Force. I did not realize until I got out there the somewhat strained relations between NASA headquarters and the Air Force. I'd heard about it, but it took me about a good 6 months to break down that barrier out there on the West Coast between myself and the Air Force people. I finally won their confidence, and things worked out quite well after that. But there was that barrier and mistrust, I would say.
What city was that in?
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles.
Yeah, it's out. It's near the airport, Air Force Systems Missile Division, I think it's called. It's in El Segundo. It's primarily just an office building with a big fence around it.
Take your family with you when you
No,
left?
I didn't. I left them home in Huntsville. Still had one in high school, so the wife decided to stay here. But she managed to fly out several times, and it worked out quite well.
How long did that assignment last?
Just about a year.
About a year.
Just a little bit less than a year. Then the announcement came up for the comptroller's job at Marshall. So I applied for it and was selected and took over the comptroller's job, '89.
Why don't you describe what the comptroller does? There may be people watching these that don't understand what a comptroller at a place like Marshall does.
That is somewhat difficult to explain from the standpoint that a lot of folks at Marshall didn't really understand what the comptroller does. But primarily, it's a central focal point of all the resources for the center. All the budgets go through the comptroller's office. All the accounting businesses. We had an accounting office of about 84 people, and of course, you know, they handle all the travel and paying the bills and so forth. And the budget side of the organization would gather all of the budgets from the various program offices and the laboratories and mail those into a center package to transmit to Washington. And of course, it's the comptroller's responsibility to defend that budget once it gets into the Washington arena. So now you're in competition with the other centers. So it's a fairly tough job from that standpoint in trying to sell. We also had an organization within the comptroller's office that looked at different business management concepts, trying to decide which new concepts that are floating around in industry might be applicable to our program offices and project offices. So we had a group of about 10 or 15 folks that worked in that area.
Would that include various strategic planning exercises and other things?
The strategic planning in terms of future programs primarily came out of program development.
Okay.
And so they kind of handle that activity, and we work just primarily the business side of it. But that was a lot of fun too. That lasted until I retired, until in 96. 10 years ago I've been retired.
Who did you interface with at headquarters when you were a comptroller? Who was your counterpart there?
Primarily with the comptroller in Washington.
Who was that?
Well, that's the last one they had was the and I forgot his name now, but he was the comptroller in the state of Maryland.
Oh.
And apparently Barbara Mikulski, the senator from Maryland, sold our administrator on taking this guy. It was interesting because he came from the outside of NASA and had a little bit different philosophy on things. And we had at Marshall going on at the time a program to develop a agency-wide accounting system. At the time, and I'm not sure it's still not effective, each center, and we've got what, nine centers, each center has their own accounting system. You can imagine from a headquarters standpoint trying to meld information from 9 different systems. So
Congress has been very critical of that, and OMB, I guess, also.
Very, because of the inconsistencies that system, that approach has. So we at Marshall took on the responsibility, as we were given that responsibility from Washington, to develop an agency-wide system. And I'm not a software guy. But I played hell trying to get the software people to communicate and get this job done in a timely manner. It was getting kind of an expensive proposition. But anyway, this fellow I can't remember his name at the moment, when he came into the agency, he was looking at what we were doing. And he said, "That's a good idea, but why don't we just buy off-the-shelf software? There's off-the-shelf stuff out there. We did it in Maryland, so you can do it in NASA." Well, I pleaded with the guy that go look at off-the-shelf. Let us continue. Look at off-the-shelf and see if it's available and if it can be applied to the agency. And then when that happens, then we'll shut down what we're doing. But no, he insisted we shut everything down immediately, which we did, unfortunately. And I'm thinking now, which is 10, 11 years later, they might just be beginning to come up and have some kind of an integrated system, which they're recently moving, I think, to Stennis to set that out.
As comptroller, how would you deal with projects that were having overruns? What was your responsibility then?
Well, primarily to in working with the project to make sure that their information is there. As far as defending their particular problem or overrun, I would go with them and let them actually defend it. But making sure that the data is there, that it makes sense, that there is consistency in the data, and that was one of my biggest philosophies, is make sure you're consistent with your information. Nothing is more confusing to a manager than to present to him different sets of data, and the data is conflict with each other. Mm-hmm. So it's just a matter of making sure that in those cases where you did have an overrun, to make sure that the information is clear, what is being done to correct the problem, and what resources are needed to get it back in shape.
Who took over as comptroller after you left?
A fellow came down from Washington, a fellow by the name of Dave Bates. He was working in the shuttle program office in Washington, and the center director from Huntsville that went up, oh come on now, right after Jack Lee.
After Jack Lee.
I'm losing my memory on that. Anyway, he went to Washington and developed a relationship with Dave. So when he came back to Huntsville, he brought Dave back with him.
I see.
And Dave stayed out there until, I guess, about 2 years ago. And they've got a lady out there now. I don't know her name. I have not met her. I've gone out several times to meet her, but never had a chance to meet up with her.
Well, after you retired, you became active with the Marshall Retirees Association. Like you were president for a while, I believe.
Yeah, 1 year.
Can you make any comments about that organization? I think you helped get it started.
It's an organization that, unfortunately, is rather stagnant, I think. We do not have the ability to enlist new members from the recently retired folks to build our ranks. That's too bad, because I think the organization does a lot of good things. It has a lot of capability, obviously, from the folks that are currently in it, but it could do a lot more if we could find a way to get new members, additional members as they retire.
Mm-hmm. Well, what other pieces of information or incidents, anecdotes would you like to add to the record while we have an opportunity here? You must have some remembrances of your long career at Marshall that amuse you or please you or you're proud of or something?
Other than the ones we've talked about, it's, when you look back on it, it's I'm sure you hear that from a lot of the folks. It's just a great time, and I hope and I wish that the current employees out at Marshall are having as good a time as we did when we were out there, a fun time. And but unfortunately, I think because of the bureaucracy just creeps into an organization, it's kind of stifling a lot of that. And of course, the new programs aren't coming along like they should. Consequently, the folks that are there now have not gone through a development program, and that's kind of hurting them, I believe. We just had a great time.
As comptroller, did you have any way of fighting the increase in bureaucracy that grows with an organization? Was that one of your responsibilities, to try to contain the bureaucracy? You'd think that might be something the comptroller would do?
A lot of the bureaucracy that creeps in kind of comes from Congress. with increasing constraints on budgets, increasing reporting requirements, increasing audits by the GAO. You might have a person who wants to, maybe a representative or a senator that wants to get their name in the news. They call for an audit. So we've been through quite a few audits out there, and fortunately I was able to develop a good relationship with the local GAO folks that we never had any real big problems, I don't believe, while I was out there. We had a big audit on reflecting back on the selection of the solid rocket motor. I was on the business committee, in charge of the business committee for that activity, and golly, we were locked up out there for 8-10 weeks reviewing. Finally made the selection, started to write the final reports, etc. And one of the proposers protested the selection, which we didn't expect that he would, but he did. So we went through a long process of meeting with GAO. I think GAO sent more people down to review our books than I had on the review team to begin with. But after they spent, about 4 or 5 weeks, they came to me and said, "Bill, we're having difficulty concluding this whole process. What are we missing? What can we do to conclude this?" And I said, "Well, have you taken a look at the various facilities that all of these proposers are proposing for this job?" I said, "No." I said, "Why don't you do that? Why don't you just take a week or two and take your team and travel to the various points or areas that they've selected or proposed to select?" All right, so they did that. And 2 weeks later, they came back, and I went over to see them, and they said, "We're finished. We know now how to conclude this activity." So, but that was an interesting time of actually going and participating in a review with the comptroller general in Washington, and in that meeting. That's if you've never gone through one of those, it's a very interesting activity.
Now, one of the, I believe, difficult problems that a comptroller faces, besides keeping track of the monies, is what progress is being made on a project versus the amount of money spent. Did you get involved in that problem? I bet you did.
Yes, we tried to develop or implement what I call a program management measuring system to measure what kind of progress you're making on a particular project.
Exactly.
And I tell you, it's like pulling lion's teeth to implement that kind of an approach. It's fairly simple. It makes a lot of sense, but it was difficult getting the project managers to implement a system, or that particular system that we were talking about. I was challenged many times by contractors, and they said, "Well, in order to implement the system, we have to carry 2 sets of financial books." I said, "No, you don't. You really don't." But that was indicative of their reluctance to do that. And why, I'm not sure. Because from the government side, our project manager and program manager, it's a helpful tool.
Oh, yes.
Because it kind of forewarns where problems could crop up. Problems even from a technical standpoint as well as a financial standpoint. Contractors don't want it because you're getting too close into their workings. and it basically gives too much visibility to the government. So I can see their reluctance to implement, and consequently, yeah, that was a very difficult thing, and we really never were successful in implementing that across the board in a manner that each project manager could have insight or better insight as to what's really happening, and being helping from a predictor standpoint.
That gets you into PERT charts and all that stuff, I suppose.
Well, basically, yeah, the old PERT stuff was the basis of it, the groundwork, but it goes way beyond PERT. But basically, yeah, PERT is the heart of the thing. Of course, we tried PERT back in the Apollo program.
Sure.
That also foretold some problems, and the managers didn't like that. I remember Art Rudolph, and he wanted to use PERT, but he wanted to give the 8-ball to the project manager that was in the worst shape. Of course, that's negative reinforcement, and that doesn't work very well.
Yeah. Well, any final comments you'd like to make?
I can't think of any right now. I'm sure I'll think of some later on, but...
Well, thank you very much for coming, and
good to see you again.
Appreciate your being here for the interview. And
okay.
Soon you'll be online. Thank you.
Very good.